Hey everyone, it's GM Max here, and today I'm going to share with you the Zero Theory Scandinavian. The Scandinavian, of course, arising with e4, d5, queen takes d5 being the main line. But here, rather than going for the main line of queen to a5, or the alternatives like queen to d6 or queen to d8, we will be going for a little shortcut in this position. And basically, it turns out that the move of queen to e5 check, initially, it just seems like a beginner's blunder, that you're just putting the queen in a vulnerable position where you're going to lose time at being attacked later. However, it turns out that this version of Scandinavian after bishop g4 is actually not considerably worse than the other versions of the Scandinavian with a lot more theory. And this approach with takes and queen to a5 is known as the Shimanov variation, as the previously Russian, now American Grandmaster Alex Shimanov basically played this approach in a lot of online games with some quite reasonable results. And make sure to stay till the end of the training to see some of his best wins in this system from some blitz games. For the most part, though, I am going to focus on my own experiences in this variation, as I have played the queen e5 system a bunch of times in online blitz and bullet, winning every single one of my games thus far, including even a game against a player rate over 3-100 on Lead Chess Bullet. So let's get into some of the games. This first one was, from Lead Chess Bullet, quite a recent one against a 2-800. Opening moves were the same, but my opponent played this bit of a weird move of knight g2, which is actually not one that I was entirely ready for. Nowadays, I'd probably just play the move of knight f6 and just play it something like this, queen to a5, and I think that with an approach like, for example, it's hard to say exactly what move White would play, because I really have a lot of moves that they could choose between here. But say if they play some normal developing move, like, you could always play, like, e6 and knight d7, bishop b4, and, get a reasonably healthy position that way. I guess you could also put the bishop on d6 or e7 as well, depending on what they play. But, overall, there shouldn't be any major problems for Black here. With being a bullet game, I decided to play a bit more ambitiously, and play the move of c5, which, admittedly, it is a mistake here. White could play the move d4 and, get a very strong initiative with bishop f4 and such. Fortunately for me, my opponent didn't play this way, and sort of allowed me to consolidate my setup and, basically get a more or less playable position after some moves. Although d4 admittedly is quite a nice move by him. Like, probably, this, is not so great, where he is getting in the, the move of knight d5. And, after knight to d5, we just jumped ahead a bit there. But after knight d5, we can see, this is a bit of a problem, and, it kind of shows why the move c5 is not so great compared to just knight to f6. Knight e2 is not a move you're going to face all that often, but just thought I'd mention it for the sake of completeness. Another move that you're also going to see sometimes, not as much as bishop e2, but at lower levels you'll probably see queen e2 quite a bit. And there's a few approaches you can take, where probably the best one is just to take and play like knight f6 and just go for a normal development. And that kind of gives you an improved sort of Scandinavian, where, in a position like this, even a move like d4 is not so convenient, of why it doesn't really have a comfortable way to defend the c2 pawn. But if they're limited to, let's say, playing something like d3, then, a position like this is just going to be totally fine for Black. You can either play e6 and just not care about knight h4, or if you are concerned about it, you can play h6 and then just play the usual setup with a, completely fine position for Black in the endgame. So that's probably what I should have done. In the game, I sort of played it more creatively with the move of knight c6, which does allow them to take in d4, which is not really ideal, but I guess I was in a bit of a creative mood in this game. The move a6 I played is sort of afraid of knight to b5, but it would be just better to play bishop f5 and just castle long would be, obviously a lot more harmonious for Black. End of the game, my opponent played a bit weirdly. We ended up just letting me take the pawn on c2 for free. But it turns out White does actually get very good compensation after d5, and, for this reason, I probably should have, just played, just quiet developing moves instead. But anyway, it's true, this game was probably not the most instructive one by me, but again, kind of gives an example of what to avoid. That, you should just play normal Scandinavian setup and just be fine. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, do make sure to leave a like and also to consider subscribing. So our next game, yeah, this one I think I played back in 2013 actually, where this is at the time where I didn't know about this move of bishop to g4, which is sort of considered the, let's say, main line based on Shimanov's games. But if you do want to play it in the style of a normal Scandinavian where you just avoid all of the theory, then you can also play the move c6, which is the way I initially played this system, which, if you're wondering about the name, is actually called the Partsov variation of Queen e5, because of the saying Partsov sees a check, Partsov plays a check. But yeah, in this game I ended up getting more or less a fine position, where my opponent didn't play the more critical move of playing d4 and such, which we'll get to a bit later. But play this more quiet d3, which more or less just gives black a fine position here. You know, only knight h4 by white is really giving white any sort of advantage. But at this point, yeah, he should just take and play a move like bishop f3. And yeah, the bishop pair advantage will give white a little something, but of course black will, you know, develop quite normally and have a very healthy position as well. You can either castle short or castle long, depending on your feeling, but it is probably objectively better just to play it safe and castle short. But in the game, my opponent played bishop f4, and I think that in general, when you've got less space, the exchange of the minor pieces is just going to be in black's favour here, where, for instance, if white now takes, we can see how the pawns are very nicely shutting out the white bishop. The rest of the game wasn't so interesting. Like, my opponent played some slightly weird moves like knight e2 and knight g2, bishop f3, and it just allowed me to have this very comfortable position where I have an unopposed light squared bishop. And later in the game, I was able to kind of push in the center and just outplay my opponent from there. So, yeah, as you can see with this opening, you're obviously not going to ever like any super quick wins for the most part, because it just leads to a much more slower placed position. But it's a way to get a Scandinavian type position or Caro-Kann type position, where you're not worrying about, say, your queen coming under attack with moves like bishop d2, or if the queen's on d6, knight b5, or bishop f4 so much. The next game's actually a bit of a funny one. Like, I sort of share it more as a joke almost more than anything else, because my opponent here just blundered a bishop with bishop f4 and, you know, resigned after my next move. But I do want to point out that white does actually have a pretty strong continuation here. That being said, it's one I think your opponents are very unlikely to find unless they looked at this beforehand with a computer. But it turns out the best move white is actually the move of d5, which at first looks like just a blunder of a pawn, but actually, if you play c takes, white has this move of knight b5 and then bishop f4, and it actually becomes very hard to comfortably defend knight c7. You do have knight a6, but then c4 comes, and white's just getting way too strong an attack on the black king. Like, black is just way too far behind in development at this point. And if you go ed5 instead to avoid knight b5, that's better, but white can still go knight d4 and still have a pretty strong attack, like rook e1, you know, threatening some discoveries with bishop e7. Turns out the move of h4 is quite strong, where white just sort of threatens to win our bishop, and if we try to avoid it, say, with h5, then they go bishop d3, and yeah, white just gets a really strong attack for the pawn with knight f5, and it's just not really playable for black. At the same time, yeah, it's sort of the only way somebody really is going to find d5 is if they analyze with a computer beforehand. And because this line is so rare in practice, it's unlikely your opponent will know of this idea, let's say. It is true they could also play it via a version with d4 and, you know, bishop f5. Here as well, the move d5 does exist as a, you know, as an option for white. Though here you can at least play knight f6 and, you know, exchange that way. So it's still not maybe as effective for white as, you know, as some other versions we'll see later. But anyway, that's just to show like what kind of the worst case scenario is. If they don't find a move d5, you basically get a pretty safe position with normal developing moves. And I think it's a reasonable gamble against most opponents. Now, for our next game here was a rematch I played against the same guy. I think I played it in maybe 2022 from memory, where I just played this same setup. And yeah, like I mentioned before, white can consider the move d5 and can also consider a move like knight e5. Yeah, these approaches, if white does play it quite aggressively, they will give white a small advantage. But I do think that, let's say against players below 2500 or so, you could probably still make this work, like playing queen a5 and e6 and developing normally. And, you know, unless white plays quite precisely, you are going to get a reasonable position here as black. Like the engine lines, for example, are based on playing moves like b4 and just sacking a pawn cold here, which is obviously not like the move that most human players are going to even consider at this point. Ditto for moves like d5 for white. Now, after castles and e6, like I said, the move white really should play is d5, or if not d5, at least the move, the Ridley move of knight h4 to, win the bishop pair and get some sort of edge in this way. But yeah, in the game I played bishop e3, just playing a little bit too passively, and we can see it only takes a couple of slightly passive moves here for black to already have, full equality. Actually, I think bishop d6 first is even more precise, just to stop them playing knight h4 so easily, but yeah, in the game I end up playing it a move later, and I think already black has the better side of equality. The move I played with h5 and going for this attack is probably a little bit too optimistic. The engine doesn't hate it, but it's not like one of the top choices. Like knight h4, for instance, was a good reply by him after bishop g4. I mean, I was able to exchange off the bishops and still have an okay position, but yeah, I think with the way the game played out, like maybe castling long, objectively speaking, is probably a little bit too optimistic, but it's also true that the engine idea of just castling short and just playing the pawn h5 is, yeah, maybe not the most natural from a human point of view, but maybe it was a better way to play it. For you guys, it's probably better just to castle, just play simple chess and, tuck the bishop away, prepare a c5 or e5 break, and that's going to give you, I think, very comfortable play here. Like when white's played g3 nitro, it's just a lot less scary because you just have squares available for your bishop, other than the usual bishop g6 retreat. So yeah, that was kind of a fun game. Like I feel the game loses maybe a little bit of its relevance from this point, but anyway, let's see the next one that I played in this line. And this is, I think, the final game I played with c6, so I remember it correctly. But I want to show this approach as well, just so you kind of have two different ways of playing the system, like the more normal Scandinavian approach with c6, and the more creative Shimanov variation with bishop to g4. Because it means even if your opponent, let's say, prepared for you in some situation, well, it gives you a little bit of variety where you can still keep them guessing a little bit. It also makes it more interesting for you that way. And in this game, I actually went for a bit of a different approach, where rather than playing bishop f5, I actually decided to play the move knight f6, which is probably similar in strength to the move bishop f5. The advantage is that you make the d5 break less effective. So let's say if your opponent prepared bishop f5, d5, well, this might throw him a little bit of a spanner in the works. The disadvantage is it does admittedly make the move knight e5 a bit more effective, where in this version, like, you probably would prefer to have played bishop f5 rather than knight f6, although, to be fair, the difference is pretty small here, like, after castles. Like, the issue is just that they have moves like g4 and b4 that are kind of a bit more effective than usual, but if you don't think your opponent's going to find these sort of moves, then yeah, you could probably make this work up to, let's say, 2-400 or 2-500-ish level. Above that, you're going to kind of suffer a lot, but below that, you should probably be able to get away with it. In the game, my opponent played castles, and bishop f5 would sort of be the normal move that we saw before. But here I decided to be a little bit more creative and played a move of bishop to g4 instead, showing a different way of playing it, even beyond just putting the bishop on f5. Now, it's true this does have disadvantages, where, once again, the move d5 does prove quite strong for white. It is true that it's probably a bit easier to find such a move when black hasn't played the move e6 already to try to discourage it. That's kind of the disadvantage of black's setup, but if they don't find this move, you sort of end up getting a reasonably playable position. Like, knight e5 is kind of less effective now when you're able to sort of recycle the light square bishops and, be able to play e6 without shutting the bishop inside the pawn chain. Also, if they do play h5, you can, in the worst case, just take, and yeah, white's going to be better with the bishop pair in the space, but you get a relatively solid position without any weaknesses, where there's still enough scope to outplay a weaker player from here. Again, against grandmasters, you might suffer a little bit, but against everyone else, you'll probably be okay. In the game, my opponent played a bit passively with bishop e3. I probably should have just played e6 immediately, but ended up being a bit creative and playing knight bd7 and just sort of keeping the tension with bishop h5. Which again does allow white to play d5, which is a break I probably shouldn't have allowed in this version. But once it goes rook e1 and e6, everything just kind of fits together quite nicely. And it's one nice thing about this shortcut system, like, even though objectively it's not so great for black, white has to play quite precisely to prove it. Like, all it has to do is play a couple of slightly natural but not so accurate developing moves, and black just equalizes very, very quickly. Probably white's best bet to actually go knight a4 and just try to get in the move c4. But the waste of time with moves like knight a4 and knight back to c3, it does afford us the time to hit back in the center with e5 or c5 to have a relatively playable position here as black. Or you can even just build up more gradually and also be fine. But in the game, white played queen d2, never really solving the problem of the knight blocking the c-pawn after bishop g5. I'm a little surprised I didn't play the move h6 here. I think the idea might have occurred to me only after I played rook a to d8. I'm not a big fan of self-pinning the knight, even if it doesn't really mean a lot at the moment. But yeah, when he plays queen e3, queen e2, that already tells you he has no idea whatsoever in this position. And I really should just play h6 directly, but end up waiting one more move and then playing the move h6. And basically your dream break here in these middle games is just to play the move c5 at the right moment and trade off white's extra central space. A lot like in a Caro-Kann, actually, where after takes, we can see here that, black has a central majority, his pieces are a lot more active than white's, and we're threatening bishop h2 already to win the queen with discovery. The game went queen c1. I played bishop e7, which is a little bit passive. I think I should just play b5 and just play on the queen side. This was, not really so necessary, and I think the game does maybe lose a little bit of its relevance from this point, because it just ends up being an endgame where, there just isn't really any sort of special edge, where I did go on to win the game because my opponent played some weird moves like bishop c5, just giving up the bishop pair for no reason, and that sort of allowed me to outplay him from here. Instead, I should just play knight e5 and just annoy my bishop, but yeah, he didn't do that, and I was able to outplay him later on in the game, which was, definitely quite nice. The next game we have here, is sort of the first one featuring the bishop to g4 plan. By the way, I will also mention at the very end of the video how to meet knight f3, just so you're prepared for that as well. But yeah, basically knight c3, queen e5, bishop e2. I think in this game, my opponent just made a bad pre-move, where he just assumed I was going to play like c6 or something. Because, knight f3 is pretty clearly a mistake. I just get in knight c6, stopping him playing the move d4. And I mean, you can even put the knight on d4 and just win back his bishop pair, and you just have a better position because of white's really weak structure. But in the game, you just blundered a pawn, and it was pretty easy for me to convert the extra pawn from here. Actually, knight e2 is a mistake. I'm not sure why I didn't just castle long and just keep the initiative that way, but the game, I guess, loses its relevance a little bit from this point. So let's move on to the next one, where in this next game against a pretty low-rated player in bulletonchess.com, he played this weird move of h3, which is, a move that we're pretty happy to see, because if we compare it to the actual game, basically, white's just going to be a full tempo down on, the main line that we'll see with the move d4 from the start of the training. Here the normal move would just be knight f6, but here I was a little bit more creative and played a move of knight c6 instead. I ended up putting the queen on a5. Based on seeing Shimanov's games, I think I would probably play queen h5 now and go for this sort of pin on the knight instead. You don't really have to fear d5 because you always have the long castles pin to sort of keep the pressure on the d5 pawn in that way. But I went queen a5, which is also fine. Bishop d2 castles, and white already has a bit of a hard time defending this pawn, where he probably should just play the move d5. And you can play knight e5, and you should still more or less be fine here as black. I think in the game I was intending to play knight b4 and attack the pawn, but the problem is after knight f4, then my knight is sort of going to be really sidelined after it gets kicked away with a3, which makes the whole premise not so appealing for black. But instead he just let me take the pawn for free, and you end up having a better position with the extra pawn. I mean, a computer will say that white's still fine with correct play, but of course with the extra pawn it's easy to play black. And I did go on to win pretty comfortably after a few fairly inept moves. This allowed me to consolidate the extra pawn, complete development, and just win the game from there. So not so much to see with this game. Now this one's one of my very best wins actually in League Chess Bullet. Recently I've been getting some more wins against free 100 plus opposition. Like just yesterday actually I got a win, I think 3.5, 2.5 in a match against a free 146 player in Bullet. Maybe I'll share that in a later video. But with this game my opponent, already you could tell he wasn't really prepared for bishop g4. Because he played this move f3, which, to be fair, is not maybe an outright mistake, but I think that if you compare this position, let's say, to the variations with queen a5, and these are variations I cover in my course Play the Strongest Scandinavian, which, let's say if this video inspires you, let's say not just to play the Scandinavian, but where you want to learn how to play it in the very best way, then I can definitely recommend, my course as a very efficient way to master this opening from black's point of view. But if you sort of compare this position with this one, you can sort of see it's kind of the same thing, but where white sort of got the bishop on e2, which is actually interfering with white's development, compared to the somewhat healthier move of bishop to d2. Now, he played a move of g4 in this position, and I mean, you could play bishop g6 and just meet h4 of h5 and, make a very valid point that the pawn stop's not that effective here. But I decided to play bishop to d7 and just say that g4 is a bit weakening. That's a lot harder for white to get castled here. White's best bet might just be to go bishop d2 and just try to make it a more normal kind of position. But in the game, he went bishop f4, which a computer actually really likes the idea of playing e5 and just sacking a pawn and just going for the attack that way. But I have to admit, this move just didn't occur to me at all. Like, if I was going to play something else, it was probably going to be e6 and just sort of developing kind of normally in this sort of way. But I ended up playing the move h5, just wanting to weaken his structure. And while it might not be the best move, it ended up being practically quite a good choice, because he played the move g5 and just allowed me to just get these very comfortable squares for my knights. The move g3-6 is quite creative by my opponent, where my best bet might actually just be to just leave the pawn there as more of a long-term weakness. In the game, I end up playing takes, and here I probably should just play the move knight e7 and just defend the pawn, and just have, a perfectly fine position in this way. I'm not sure why I didn't play this move, like I can just bring the knight to f5, but for some reason I decided just to give back the pawn, which was not really a great idea, like my king's just really weak in the center. And yeah, I did go on to win the game, but it wasn't really because of the opening, because at this point white is just much, much better, with my king just being way too weak, so kind of got lucky in this game. Like, I really should just play knight e7 and then black would be doing quite fine. But yeah, in the end, well, the result was quite good, even if the opening choices weren't ideal at this point. The final game I want to share from my lead chess experience is a game I played actually just this month, in fact, in April. Actually, no, it's already May the 1st I record this, so yeah, it was played last month technically, but yeah, this one my opponent did play the more critical d4, but I noticed that already after queen a5, he was maybe not feeling so comfortable. Because his move at bishop d2, it's maybe not outright a mistake, but it's also a move that I think you're relatively happy to see, compared to move of castles, which we'll see a bit later in the training. Now, after bishop d2, I just played knight f6. Knight to e4 is what he did, trying to get the discovery. Now, here I maybe should have just played the move queen d5 or queen f5 and kind of gone for a similar position again, but where my queen is just a lot more active in comparison. So, for example, after castles, rook g8 is kind of... It prompts him to make some slightly weakening move around the king to defend himself. Well, unless he sacrifices a pawn with knight f4. But, yeah, not everyone is willing just to sack a pawn in this sort of way. I mean, it's probably the move that I would play as white. But, yeah, I'm a bit more of like a... Well, my style's probably a bit closer, let's say, to a Gukesh or Abdusattorov than, say, a Karpov or a Carlsen, let's say. But anyway, after knight e4, I played queen to a6. And yeah, after knight f6, you could sort of make an argument for every one of these captures, but I think that gf6 is going to be the most appealing here, where you just get that counterplay down the g file. Although, to be fair, I probably should have gone knight c6 and gone for the pressure against white center first. White's still somewhat better here, because I didn't play the very best way, but it gives you a feel for how these sort of positions can play out, at least. After bishop f4, I played the move of queen c6, which does allow to move d5. Like, honestly, I'm not that happy with my opening play in this game, because white does have some pretty strong attacking options that, yeah, make this a bit difficult. So, in the end, I did go on to win the game, but I was a bit lucky, because my opponent came up just blundering a piece in a position where he was better. So I think that, yeah, the lesson here is just play queen d5 instead. Or play the move queen f5 if you really want to avoid the doubled pawns. But I still think even here you probably would take with the pawn anyway and have that play down the g file to work with. But yeah, queen d5 is probably the move I'd go for, and then black should just be fine, basically. Moving on to the next game, this one was one I played very recently, actually, on chess.com. I think I actually just played it yesterday or the day before, but yeah, this game my opponent played bishop e3, which strikes me as a slightly odd move. Because the thing is, you're never really going to be, I think, that tempted to castle long here as white. Because if black just plays knight c6, it's kind of one difference with the Shimanov variation, that you still have the option to develop the knight a bit more actively rather than just playing the usual c6, knight d7. Although, to be fair, if you wanted to play like knight d7, c6, like this would of course be very much fine for black as well here, where the exchange of light square bishops does reduce the extent of your cramp in a sense. But yeah, knight c6 is a little bit more dynamic. Like moves like knight b4 can be considered, and you have decent pressure against the d4 pawn as well for a fine game. But my opponent played castles, and already at this point, black is just completely fine once it gets both knight f6 and the move e6 in. And that's sort of the idea of the Shimanov variation. Like, they have to play quite directly already on move 7 in order to have any sort of major advantage, as we'll explore a bit later. But looking at how the game played out, like queen d3, I played a move bishop d6, which is trying to play a bit more actively, but I think I would probably prefer bishop e7, objectively speaking. But just to get you out of the way of some knight e4 or knight b5 nonsense. But after bishop d6, yeah, he didn't play the move knight b5. I was sort of gambling a little bit that he wouldn't see this move. But this would give white a bit of an advantage in a position like this, let's say. But instead he played a3. I went for the move knight bd7. Again, it's probably more precise to go c6 and avoid knight b5, but the way I played the game kind of worked out, where after takes c6, I just get this very normal position for the Scandinavian or Caro-Kann, but where the exchange of two minor pieces just make this completely fine for black. Where actually here I missed a little bit of a tactic where I could have actually played the move takes and queen h5 and actually won a pawn with the fork as such. That would have been a very nice find here, but the move I played is also pretty decent. I just end up going for this endgame that, it's basically just totally fine for black, and in the end I went on to outplay my opponent, where if you want to maximize your winning chances in positions, there's kind of two ways to do it. Like, one way is just to take and, get this bishop versus knight imbalance. We can sort of go for moves like b5 and sort of go for a bit of a light squared strategy in a sense, just anchoring the knight on d5 as it were. Or you can just play like a healthy move like bishop e7 and then just take back with the g-pawn and kind of use that structural imbalance and knight versus bishop imbalance as a way to play for the win. I'm not sure if my moves here were necessarily the best, but what I ended up doing was I basically ended up just kind of building up the position quite steadily, just like playing a lot of healthy moves, and so just waiting for him to kind of play a move like g3, so that I could then go h4 and basically, trade off my extra pawn island that way. For what it's worth, the computer also likes it playing c5. There's another way in which you can open up the position for your bishop and kind of, try to get in that way. But yeah, I went on to win the game after a bit of a lengthy struggle. It's probably the sort of position, like, if you had this in a classical game, it would probably end in a draw a lot of times from this sort of position. But in a faster time control, yeah, there's always going to be some sort of chance that comes up, let's say, except against the very best players in the world. With that being said, now we can conclude by sharing with you a few of Shimanov's games, and I'm going to share with you a couple of wins he had against Fabiano Caruana. I believe these games were played in Title Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, the Title Tuesday Blitz event. But yeah, after knight f6, Caruana obviously was a little bit surprised by this, and he didn't know the best move of b4, which is what we're going to see a bit later in the training as such. But white played a move knight g3, maybe wanting to avoid some queen h5 later or something. But after knight c6, black's already just doing fine with the pressure against the pawn on d4. As usual, d5 just met with long castles, and we just pick up the pawn in that way. So Caruana, rather than playing some move like bishop e3 and just developing quietly, he decided to play the move knight c to e4. And yeah, Shimanov decided to make it a bit more unbalanced. Like, if you want to equalize, you could just take the knight and then castle, but if you want to put a bit more pressure on white, this is kind of the way to do it. Where, at this point, the best move for white apparently is to play knight g5 and hit this pawn, but it's not the most natural move. Like, even queen d5 and just pushing is going to be more than fine for black. And if c3, yeah, again, you've got ideas like, takes queen d5, and again, you just get an e5 quite quickly to eliminate white's space advantage very, very fast, as it were. But in the game, white played knight f6, black decided to take back with the pawn. If you want to grab a pawn, you can also just take with rook d4 first, but the game saw gf6, c3, and h5 is a very thematic way to create counterplay against the white king, and after queen f3, h4, knight e2. So the idea of Caruana's queen f3 is that now we can't play e5 or e6 so easily because of the pressure on the pawn. But because we can always develop our bishop this way, we don't really need it at the same time. Where h3 was a nice way to kind of either open up white's king or, prompt this fawn pawn on h3 that will always give you counter-attacking chance against the king. Like, for example, e5 even becomes possible here because queen f6 and queen d5 is already asking some tough questions of the, the defensive g2. Turns out actually black's already just much better here, surprisingly. But the move played in the game of GH3 was admittedly a mistake, where now the white king is just way too exposed, and after bishop f4, queen f5, nice little move to pin and hit this guy. Queen g4, queen h7, and what we see here is that black is just much better, where he regained the pawn, he ended up, getting this attack on h2, and black went on to win a very nice game from here. So if it's capable, it's possible to outplay the world number 2. I think he wasn't world number 2 at the time, but like if you're capable of playing the current world number 2 with this system in Blitz, I think it speaks volumes to the practical strength of this queen e5 system, at least as a surprise weapon, let's say. That is, if your opponent is not well prepared for this queen e5 bishop g4, well then it can bring, I think, some quite good results. Now, I do think that at the Grandmaster level, people are going to start preparing for this, having seen Shimanov's games, but below that, I think you are going to catch a lot of people out. So, after castles and knight f6, so if you're wondering, well, why not play a move like e6 here to avoid the b4 plan? Well, the problem is that now d5 becomes a lot more effective, just threatening to saddle us with an isolated pawn on e6. And if you try to stabilize with e5, then white can just go f4, and white just ends up having a bit too big of a lead in development here. So that's why we play the move knight f6 instead. We let them play b4. But if they do play d5, which is what Caruana played in, I believe, his second game against Shimanov in this variation, well, we still have a somewhat playable position where black played a quite logical move to my mind of g6 here, just putting pressure against the d5 pawn. You could also play a move like g6 and play passively, but I do think it gives white a little bit of an easy life here. So that's why I think c6, practically speaking, is the most logical. Because like the best move for white here is to play b4, but it's not a very human move in a sense. I mean, to be fair, the move Caruana played, knight f4, is also fine, just keeping the tension. And after takes, knight f d5, take. It's worth pointing out the endgame is actually not such a big problem for black. Like, just go knight a6, kick the knight away, and you just get a normal queenside majority versus central majority pawn structure, which you'll often see in positions like the Alpen Sicilian and the French Tarrasch, for example, as well as various lines of the Slav and QGD. In, let's say, not even in a reverse version, it does come up a lot there as well. But yeah, knight d5 was played, and I mean, yeah, white is going to be slightly better in this position, but it's pretty healthy for black. In fact, maybe I'm even selling black a little bit short here. I think black is probably just doing fine. The computer is saying that you should play c4 and sack a piece for attack, but I don't think any human is really going to find such a move, realistically speaking. The move rook e1 is looking so much more natural, but after knight c6, we're now ready to be a little bit annoying with the pin on the knight, as it were. If they do play a move like bishop f4, we can actually then castle long to avoid knight c7 in that way. So I plays bishop g5. It's a good move to stop rook d8 or long castles. But after bishop d6, black's still doing fine. The game went bishop h4, knight e5. Knight e3 is already probably a little bit inaccurate. Caruana's idea being to set up some knight c4 forks, say if bishop takes b2. But if black had played queen a4, this would have admittedly asked some slightly tricky questions of white here, which avoids knight c4 and hits the bishop at once. But the game move of queen c7 was also fine, king h1, castles, and I mean, black is just completely fine in this position. b5 maybe is not the most precise thing knight g4 is, and really going to cause some tricky questions around the king side. But if black plays some other normal move, like say if you play a move like h6 or knight e7 and bring the knight around this way, like pretty much any normal move is just going to be fine for black at this point. So yeah, that's obviously a pretty successful outcome for black in terms of how the rising early middle game. Now let's get to the worst case scenario. With my trainings, I do believe that whenever you're covering an opening, you really should be, intellectually honest and say that, these are the best moves for the opponent. Like, this is the worst case scenario for us. So now I'm going to show you the line that basically does give white a pretty significant advantage if he plays correctly. He could also play the move b4 first here, but it does mean that like after queen h5, it is very likely to transpose back into the game. So in the game, after castles knight f6, b4, queen h5, Alan Pichot, by the way, he was the top Argentinian grandmaster for some time, but recently he changed federations to Spain. Now, the best move for white probably is just to play queen d3, as we'll see in the next game. Because if you play the immediate knight to f4, which is what Pichot did, the problem is after takes an e6, the ending is just going to be fine for black. You know, we're gaining a tempo on the pawn to kind of slow up any d5 ideas. If they do play d5 anyway, you can play the move e5 and just kind of keep the position pretty stable in this way. You know, compared to the other version we saw, black just has much better development in this case. Such that after rook e1, you can even get away with just castling long. As if they do take on e5, what's going to happen is, well, then the knight's no longer defending b4. So you can just take back the pawn and just be much better as such. So this position would be fine for black. And this perhaps explains why the move a3 was played. Now, there's a few decent options for black. Like knight bd7 is fine, but if you want to play a move like c6 to avoid a d5 push, or even a move like knight c6 to hit the pawn, this would of course be fine as well. So it turns out d5 is actually not quite as scary as it looks here. But yeah, knight d7 was fine. Knight b5. Black started to accept a bit of an imbalance in the position, playing bishop d6. If you did want to just play king d8 and kick the knight back, of course this would also be fine. It turns out that, yeah, your king on d8 is not that big of an issue when you do have pressure against the c4 pawn. And your position like this would of course be quite okay for black. But yeah, Shimanov's move is also fine. c4, a6. And I'm kind of surprised that white didn't take and just sort of nurse this, very small advantage with the extra space. I don't think the bishop is necessarily better than the knight, but white's structure does have that little bit of extra flexibility. But I think you can sort of make the point that's a little bit easier to play for white, even though we do get the d5 outpost as a sort of compensating factor. But after knight c3, black is just doing very, very well. I think that what maybe white missed is that the move knight fb6 is just really good here. Maybe he thought he had c5, but after takes a knight d5, we're just basically better here. Where we have the, monster outpost for the knight. The bishop for white is really very stuck in a position like this. Like bishop e5, we go f6, but if, say, they put the bishop on, I don't know, at d2, that's clearly a very passive square, and we're just going to pile the pressure on d4 to make white's life really very miserable at this point. So maybe this explains why he played the move d5 in the game. But in this case, if black had simply played the move bishop to e5 and hit the knight, then white would just be in a world of hurt here. The problem being if bishop d2 trying to defend everything, knight c4 is now a lot more effective than the game, because d6 we just take and we just remove the defender and win the piece basically. So that's kind of showing a nice example. I think the game loses some of its relevance from here, but it does show how even a strong 2600 GM end up in a worse position quite quickly as soon as he was put in unfamiliar territory. And this is something that I've found for myself playing a lot of bullet games recently, is that even strong players are going to make mistakes quite soon after they leave book, especially in faster time controls. So it does give a little bit of added value to finding that surprise element. And it just sort of helps that this is also kind of a good practical weapon at the same time. Now, our final game was between Sanal against Bryakin. Bryakin being a Soviet grandmaster who I believe now resides and is a coach in Thailand, while Farp Sanal is a quite creative Turkish grandmaster. And yeah, Queen e3 is a very good move, showing some either good preparation or a very good feel for the position. But after e6, I think his move at bishop f4 is probably not one of the more critical options, let's say. It's not a mistake by any means, but I think that here, knight f4 is really the move that kind of makes our system look a little bit sad, let's say. Because we're basically forced into this endgame after takes, where, having the doubled pawns is not like as bad as it looks necessarily here. Because you do often have these sort of double pawns in the Korchnoi variation also. But we do have to admit that white is going to be quite significantly better. Like, white just has the better pawn structure, lead in development. You can play a move like knight e2, try to play c4. Here as black, I'd probably play the move b5 and, accept that, white's better, but at least we have some ideas where, position remains, somewhat playable for black in a sense. And that's very often what modern chess is like in terms of opening preparation. Basically playing variations with black where, we reduce our theoretical workload, and where, if they find all the right moves, they get a bit of an edge, but where we're going to ask them some difficult questions and at least force them to think on their own rather than, say, playing against a computer or against a chessable course for the first 25 moves. In the game, you play the move bishop f4. I will say the move a3, just a normal move, is not going to be bad for white either. Although it does mean here black does get some extra options, you're not forced to play queen f5. But you do get the extra option to take on f4, even if it should still be better for white. But I digress a bit. after bishop to f4, black played a move knight b6. I mean, probably the best move is just to play bishop b4 and make the point that you can just give the pawn back and sort of neutralize the white initiative to some extent in this way. Like in a lot of positions, you're going to have moves like even queen g6 as well, to sort of offer a queen, trade of queens and slow white down a little bit in that way, like once you have a few more pieces developed. But yeah, basically in the game, knight c6 was played, which does make knight b5 arguably a bit more effective, but okay, a3 was played, and once black castles long, he just has, again, that standard quite healthy pressure against the pawn on d4. Rook 81 is natural, but probably not the best move. Already moves like e5 become quite tempting when you've got the pin on the pawn, but Breakin's move of bishop d6 is, of course, perfectly fine as well, and I think that already the position is definitely a lot easier to play for black. Knight b5 is probably not ideal, because the knight's going to get kicked anyway, and the pawn is going to be a bit of a thorn in white's side. Rook hd8, and yeah, we can already see that white is having a bit of a hard time just keeping things afloat here. Apparently, it was actually quite strong for black to play knight g4 here. Queen g3, and now knight g5 is a really nice idea. We just sort of hit the pawn and, just kind of set all these sort of tactical threats where you basically are forcing white in this kind of ugly ending after knight f4, queen g4, take. Like, it just becomes really hard for white to defend the pawns. If d5, we can even play knight to f6, just using the pin on the pawn. After knight c3, ed5, like, we basically win a pawn here with knight e7, and that's going to give us probably even almost a technically winning position at this point. So it gives you an idea of the problems white faces. In the game, like, black did go on to win, but perhaps the game loses some of its relevance where, black is certainly doing well, but yeah, the move d5 was a little bit of a blunder, where after knight g4, queen g3, knight f5, queen h3, black is just winning material by force, because you've got this, and, well, if d6 in the game, like, black was even just able to just kind of play this much better endgame, just saying that white's pawn is very weak, and then, if c5 and just knight d3 is just giving a complete domination with, white almost having a space disadvantage, you could say, and, the king coming in. Like, you might not be up material, but just completely dominating in this situation. But yeah, that was more or less how this game played out, where black did go on to convert his endgame advantage from here. And to conclude the training, let me just share with you a zero theory counter to knight f3, which I kind of discovered just now. Now, admittedly, what you really should be playing at some point in your Scandinavian career is, at some point you really should learn the theory with bishop g4 and knight c6, because this is a way for black to, get quite close to full equality as such. White does have some different moves you do have to be ready for, but for the most part, you can handle them with aplomb. But let's say if you are wanting something more in the spirit of the rest of the repertoire, like without any theory, but a little bit tricky and forcing white to be a little bit precise, then I think that the move bishop f5 can be an interesting alternative. This is actually something I remember Ian Rogers showed me, I think back in 2010 or 2011. I think it was 2011, where he showed me this fun idea that, d4 now is a mistake because of the move queen e4, and, now you have this fork where, either white sacrifices a pawn or, puts the king on d2, which just looks, absolutely horrible here. Any normal move is going to be fine in that case. It's also worth pointing out, I guess, after d4, you could still play bishop f5 here as well, because white doesn't really have better, I think, than the move knight to f3. Guess they could play the move knight c3, a little bit of an awkward move order maybe, but yeah, this is something that you could, arguably gamble into to some extent. Because if they play d4, they're probably not playing knight c3 in next move most of the time. But again, at some point, you probably are going to want to learn moves like e5 or knight c6 to, to equalize the play as such. But going back to knight f3, bishop f5, if they do play knight c3 here, I find that it's a bit less effective maybe in this version in general. Although it's true, they do have a move like b4, which, is going to be a little bit annoying when you develop the bishop. If they don't find b4, I think you get a reasonably playable position where, let's say if you haven't bought my course on, the Playing Stronger Scandinavian, which we were transposed with black plays knight f6. Well, it's worth pointing out that the best move for black here might actually be to play independently with knight c6. We don't really mind all that much if the pawns get doubled, but you also get some nice pressure against the white center to... I mean, white's better, but at least it's a playable position for black, without any sort of theoretical workload required. Now, if they play bishop e2, which is kind of the normal way to play knight f3, which is actually something I've recommended with the white piece in some of my white repertoire courses, where you just play like developing the king side and then playing c4, knight c3, which admittedly is going to avoid some of the problems we saw in the Shimanov variation, where the knight on c3 is kind of blocking white from having a good pawn break in many cases. Well, here I like the move order of playing knight c6, and sort of accelerating the king-queen side development a little bit, so that we get this pressure with rook d8 hitting the pawn, prompting a move like bishop to e3. And then we just go bishop e7, and yeah, white is going to be slightly better here because of his extra space. But I think that it's a reasonably playable position for black, where, our opponent is unlikely, to be looked at bishop f5 at all. And now they're on their own, they may start to make some small mistakes. If they do play queen b3, which I think is the best move and very thematic when you develop your queen's bishop, you can even just ignore it here with castles, because if they take, you go rook b8, and you get a quite nice initiative with the rook being on b2. So that means that queen b3 in that sense wasn't even immediately all that effective. If they put their rook on d1, which is very natural here, you've got moves like knight a5 to sort of annoy their queen a bit and kind of force them into an endgame that basically is just fine for you here. Like a6 is a nice little trick, making the point the knight will be trapped if they play knight takes c7 as such. And if knight c3, yeah, you're sort of able to negate your space disadvantage a bit just by exchanging the pieces and putting some pressure against d4 with your remaining pieces as such. It's a pretty understandable setup for black. And yeah, if they do play a move like, let's say, knight e5, which is supposedly critical, I mean, here you can sort of choose whether you take and play knight e4 and, sack a pawn, but get some, let's say, drawing compensation in this ending. If you play this correctly, you'll still be able to hold the draw as black, because the extra pawn's not that valuable for white. Or if you want to keep more pieces on, you can play queen c8, and, you accept doubled pawns, but other than that, your position is reasonably sound. Like, you can bring the queen to a6 and have some partial counterplay, at least among the D and the B files, as it were. But yeah, that's kind of the worst case. Like, if you're reasonably happy with this position, I think you can play bishop f5 with confidence as a zero-theory way to get an interesting position with the Scandinavian, but where we didn't have to really learn much theory in the process. I mean, if you have completed this video, completed this training, then congratulations, you definitely know more about queen e5, probably even than most grandmasters, I would say, because most people just never really bother to say queen e5 because it's considered just a beginner's move. But we've seen here that there are a lot of interesting ideas that you can play, and that you can definitely start playing the Scandinavian in your own games. And I realize from a marketing point of view, it probably would have been smart if you just do like a 10 to 15 minute video and then promote something. But yeah, I really want to just give you the full value of, of this variation, to hold nothing back with this queen e5 line. So that even if you're playing against strong players, you'll have a good chance of being able to outplay them from the rising positions. That being said, if you do want to take your understanding and your skill in the Scandinavian to the next level, and you want to maybe learn how to play some of the main lines of the Scandinavian also, or even possibly also some dynamic lines with knight f6, if you do want to broaden your Scandinavian repertoire and really master the positions a lot deeper, then I would recommend my course Play the Strongest Scandinavian, where I do cover a lot of these different options, and I cover queen a5 in the most depth. I go really, really deep into those lines. So yeah, I've just put the link to that in the description below in case you want to check that out. But do let me know in the comments below, what are your thoughts on this Partsov variation / Shimanov variation? To clarify, the Partsov variation is where we go c6, and the Shimanov variation is with bishop g4. But let me know, which of these two variations do you personally prefer as black? And yeah, also, final thing I'll mention as well for those of you who are subscribed but maybe you're not seeing my videos, I'd recommend that you tap the notification bell and set it to all. That's going to allow you to make sure you don't miss any of my training videos, where I'm aiming to try to do one every 2 days or so on average. But it's going to ensure that you'll be able to, catch all of them and continue to improve your chess through my training as such. And yeah, whether you end up investing with my programs or just go for all my free stuff, either way, it's a pleasure, to be able to help you with your chess and yeah, do my bit to give back to the chess community. So that being said, have a great rest of your day, and yeah, take care.